I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. This particular installment is on William Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. And here I'll be focusing on Act I of the play. The Tempest was probably written in 1610 or 1611, and it's the last work of which Shakespeare is credited with having written the entire play without a collaborator. The play was listed as a comedy in the first folio, but it also is sometimes called a romance. The romance genre blends elements of comedy with tragedy and a large dose of fantasy. The language is lyrical, and there often seems to be not much concern to make the dialogue seem natural or realistic. But something that impresses me especially about The Tempest is how the drama is developed against a backdrop of early colonialism. The English colonial adventure was very new at the time that this play was written, yet somehow Shakespeare seems to have anticipated many of the consequences and effects of colonialism that would play out over the following centuries. In the 20th century, Latin American intellectuals like José Enrique Rodó and Roberto Fernández Retamar drew on Shakespeare's representation in The Tempest on the conflictual relationships between Europeans and the indigenous inhabitants of the New World to develop analyses and critiques of the dynamics of colonialism. The Martinician poet, Aimé Césaire, rewrote Shakespeare's play, adapting it to express the perspective of the indigenous colonized people rather than the European colonizers. I'll begin by discussing the characters in relation to the context of colonialism. The principal character is Prospero. Prospero has been the Duke of Milan, but he has been deposed by his younger brother, Antonio. This scenario in which a ruler is deposed by a brother relates to a general concern about property inheritance in Shakespeare's time. And the theme occurs in Shakespeare's tragedies like Hamlet and in the subplot of King Lear, and in some of his comedies like As You Like It and Much Ado About Nothing. In this play, it evokes the general dynamic of the revenge tragedy that I've spoken about in a lecture on Hamlet. At the end of the play, Prospero will regain his dukedom and exact revenge against his brother Antonio, who has usurped his ruling power. Years before the beginning of the play, Prospero and his young daughter Miranda have been set adrift on the sea in a leaky boat with not much chance of survival. They have survived, however. They have landed on a seemingly unoccupied island, a territory available to be claimed, to be appropriated, to be dominated. But the island is populated by a mortal creature called Caliban and a spirit called Ariel. At first, Prospero treats Caliban in ways that are familiar to us from the activities of European missionaries in colonial societies. He treats Caliban kindly, teaches him the European language, and tries to teach Caliban some manners. But eventually Caliban attempts to rape Miranda, and Prospero punishes him with enslavement. Here Shakespeare anticipates what would become a key feature of racist, white supremacist ideology, the idea that white women are sexually irresistible to non-white men, and that the ideal of white female purity must be protected at all costs. The other inhabitant of the island, Ariel, is a spirit, and in a way, Ariel represents the ostensible good native of the colonialist framework. Ariel does the bidding of his master Prospero more or less happily, expecting a reward of advancement and freedom eventually at the end of his service. Prospero is able to control both Caliban and Ariel because he has magical powers. He has learned this magic from deep study of certain books while he was the Duke of Milan. In fact, it is suggested one of the reasons that Prospero's brother Antonio was able to depose him was that Prospero was so deeply engaged in his book study that he neglected his duties as Duke of Milan. Against the backdrop of the history of colonialism, Prospero's book study and his magic are analogous to the Europeans' superior military power and knowledge of modern science in their conquest of the Americas, of sub-Saharan Africa, and parts of Asia. This advanced knowledge and superior technology enabled Prospero to impose a European socioeconomic structure of feudalism onto what might be seen as a sort of egalitarian, utopian state of nature. I'll have more to say about this when I discuss a particular speech in Act II by the character Gonzalo in my next webcast on the Tempest. Prospero's magical powers also enable him to set in motion a series of events to achieve his revenge. It just so happens that Prospero's brother Antonio has traveled with Alonso, the King of Naples, to Tunis for the wedding of Alonso's daughter. In their returning sea voyage from North Africa, they pass near enough to Prospero's island for Prospero, with his magic, to cause a storm that will drive them to his shore in a seeming shipwreck. So Prospero's principal enemy, his brother Antonio, and the King of Naples, who has been complicitous with Antonio in the usurpation of Prospero's dukedom, will be on his shore and at his mercy. In fact, the play opens with a scene, Act 1, Scene 1, on board the ship, in the midst of chaos, in the magical storm produced by Prospero. Alonso, the King of Naples, Antonio, the Duke of Milan, and Gonzalo, the old counselor, all aristocrats, are trying to tell the commoners, the ship's master, the boatswain, and other members of the crew, how to manage the ship in the midst of this storm. The crew tell these aristocrats to leave the management of the ship to the experts. This scene might seem superfluous, but it introduces an underlying thread of class conflict, a conflict that was becoming more pronounced in England at Shakespeare's time, with the migration of rural peasants to the towns and cities that accompanied the developing transition from the feudal agrarian economy to the emerging capitalist and proto-industrial economy. So the aristocrats retreat below decks as they have been admonished, but the crew nonetheless is unable to save the ship. It seems to have sunk. King Alonso and his court make it to shore on a different part of the island than does the king's son, Prince Ferdinand. So King Alonso believes that his son has died, and Prince Ferdinand believes that his father must have perished in the shipwreck. A couple of the king's servants, Trinculo, the court jester, and Stefano, a butler, land on yet another part of the island, not knowing that anyone else has survived from the shipwreck. Act 1, Scene 2 opens with an alarmed Miranda telling her father that she has seen a shipwreck, and she is worried that all of those aboard have died. Prospero reassures her that all the passengers are safe. Then he begins to tell her the backstory. He recounts the details of his brother Antonio's coup d'etat and tells her for the first time that she is in fact a true aristocrat. This scene establishes Prospero as a sort of surrogate dramatist, a character within the play who acts in a way as a stand-in for the playwright himself, directing the actions of the other characters, controlling the events of the play. I have discussed the function of the surrogate dramatist in Shakespeare's plays at some length in one of my lectures on Othello. Prospero's function as a surrogate dramatist is immediately evident in the second part of Act 1, Scene 2. First, he uses his magic to put Miranda to sleep. Then he summons his spirit Ariel, whom I have compared to the so-called good native of colonial ideology. Ariel assures him that all of the ship's passengers have arrived on shore safely, though in different places. and Prospero sends him on the errand of surveillance and disposition of the refugees. Then Prospero turns to Caliban, the so-called bad native, telling the grumbling and rebellious Caliban to fetch wood. Caliban reminds Prospero that he was on the island first. At the end of Act I, Scene 2, Miranda awakens and sees Prince Ferdinand on the beach. He's the most marvelous creature she has ever seen in her life, and she falls immediately in love. He, likewise, falls immediately in love with her. This, we will learn, is just as Prospero had planned. But Prospero feigns anger, treats Ferdinand rudely, makes him a prisoner, and sets him to work carrying wood. This is all a ruse. Ferdinand and Miranda play out the drama of passionate but prohibited love, as we, the audience, knowing Prospero's strategy, can look on with amusement. With that, I'll conclude this webcast, but I'll have more to say about The Tempest in another installment. As always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.